The key battles of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was arguably the greatest military mind in history. As king of Macedonia, he fought countless battles and never lost one. More importantly, he capitalized on these victories by creating an empire that stretched from Greece to India. Exploring his key battles helps us understand how, over the course of his relatively short life, he accomplished such a feat. The Battle of Chaeronea 338 BC. Alexander's first major battle occurred before he even rose to power. His father, Philip II, spent his reign establishing Macedonia as the hegemon of the Greek world. This came to a climax in the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE, in which Alexander fought alongside his father against an alliance of Greek city-states headed by Athens and Thebes. Controlling the Macedonian left flank, Alexander led a decisive cavalry charge at an opportune moment that smashed the Athenian and Theban defenses. Soon after, the Greek alliance collapsed, and Macedonia became the undisputed dominant power in the region. With this victory, Alexander also established himself as a formidable military figure. The Siege of Thebes 335 BC. Philip II was assassinated in 336 BCE, leaving Alexander as the king of Macedonia. The young leader immediately faced challenges from Balkan tribes in the north, who threatened to invade and take advantage of Macedonia's political turmoil. Alexander instead took the fight to them and crushed the Thracians, Triballi, and Illyrians. While campaigning in the north, Alexander learned of another threat. The Greek city-states, once united under Philip II, saw his death as an opportunity to revolt against Macedonian rule. After beating the Balkan tribes, Alexander marched his army south. The cities immediately stopped revolting, except for Thebes. Enraged by this act of defiance, Alexander decimated the city, destroying almost all its buildings, killing 6,000 people, and selling 30,000 people into slavery. The brutality of this affair shocked the Greek world and discouraged future revolts. The Battle of the Granicus 334 BC. After dealing with turmoil at home, Alexander turned his attention to Persia, which his father had planned to invade before he died. The first battle of this campaign occurred at the Granicus River in 334 BC. As the Persians and Macedonians gathered on opposite sides of the water, Alexander initiated a surprise attack by leading the cavalry charge across the river. This caught the Persians off guard, and they were quickly defeated. The Battle of the Granicus was important for several reasons. First, it opened up the rest of Persia to Macedonian advances. Second, it was a display of Alexander's trademark fast and aggressive attack style. Third, by attacking on the front line, Alexander engendered support among his troops, encouraging them to fight with similar ferocity and vigor for the rest of his wars. The Battle of Issus 333 BC. The next major battle of the Persian campaign occurred a year later. Alexander's first clash with Persian King Darius, the Battle of Issus, saw the Macedonians dramatically outnumbered. Even so, Alexander mitigated the Persians' numerical advantage by fighting on narrow terrain near the coast, preventing them from effectively deploying their troops. The Macedonian cavalry ultimately broke through the Persian defenses, forcing Darius to flee. This allowed Alexander to capture his family, along with massive treasure reserves. The victory also gave Alexander control of the coast, meaning he could now isolate Persia from its navy. The Battle of Gaugamela 331 BC. After taking Palestine and Egypt, Alexander recentered his focus on the Persian heartland. This culminated in the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC. Numbering between 100,000 and 250,000, Darius' army dwarfed Alexander's army of about 50,000 but was less disciplined and battle-hardened. Combined with Alexander's tactical superiority, the battle was an utter disaster for the Persians. As they tried to envelop the Macedonians, gaps opened at the center of their formation. Alexander then led a wedge-shaped cavalry charge through these gaps and almost reached Darius himself. When the Persian king fled once again, his army's morale and defenses collapsed. The Battle of Gaugamela is considered the effective end of the Persian Empire, as Alexander took its capital, Persepolis, the following year. The Battle of the Hydaspes, 326 BCE. Following a protracted conflict in Central Asia, Alexander emerged victorious and set his eyes on India. After marching his army thousands of miles, he began preparing for battle against the Indian king Porus. The most difficult engagement of Alexander's life, the Battle of the Hydaspes, saw him face off against cavalry, chariots, infantry, and war elephants. As in previous battles, Alexander ultimately prevailed due to his speed and ability to catch his enemy off guard. The two armies were stationed on opposite sides of the Jhelum River. During a storm, Alexander unexpectedly crossed the river and surprised the Indians. Despite suffering heavy casualties, the Macedonians then defeated Porus. The Battle of the Hydaspes was the last major military engagement of Alexander the Great's life. Even though they were victorious, the Macedonian army was exhausted and threatened to mutiny if they marched further into India. Alexander turned back. He ultimately reached Persia by 324 BCE but suffered enormous losses on the return journey. While planning to campaign in places like Arabia, Alexander died in 323 BCE amid mysterious circumstances. Sit down. Sit closer to the fire. The night is cold, and these old bones remember the son of Macedon, the scorching plains of Gaugamela. You ask me about him. You ask me about the battles. Not the philosopher's version, not the scrolls written by men who never smelled a burning siege tower. You want the truth of it, the taste of dust and copper in your mouth, the weight of the sarissa, the sound of 10,000 men breathing as one beast before the slaughter. I will tell you. But understand this, the king was not a man, he was a storm given flesh. And a storm does not fight single battles. It wages a single, unending war across the world. To speak of Granicus, of Issus, of Gaugamela as separate things, that is a lie of historians. It was one long, rolling thunderclap from the moment we left Pella until the monsoon wept on the Hydaspes. So, we will start at the beginning, not with a date, but with a river. The Granicus. It was there the lightning first struck for us and for Persia. Imagine it. We were young. Most of us. Hadn't even grown a proper beard. We had the arrogance of boys who had never been beaten, trained by Philip to be wolves. But Philip was dead, murdered in the theater at Aegae. The Greek cities sniffed the air, smelled weakness, thought the wolf pack would scatter without the alpha. The Illyrians and Thracians tested the borders. Alexander, he didn't just scatter them. He erased their armies from the earth with a speed that made the world hold its breath. Then he turned south. Thebes, that ancient city of Oedipus and Heracles, thought they could defy him. We marched 300 miles in 13 days. 13. When we arrived, he didn't just defeat Thebes, he obliterated it. Every house, every temple, except the house of the poet Pindar, out of respect. 30,000 people sold into slavery in a single afternoon. The ground of Boeotia drank their tears and their blood. The message was not subtle. It was written in fire and screaming, "You belong to him, or you belong to the dead." So, the League of Corinth, all those sleek, oily politicians from Athens and Sparta, they fell over themselves to crown him hegemon of all Greeks, for the great crusade against Persia. Revenge for 150 years of Persian meddling and burning. It was a beautiful lie, and we all knew it. It was a pretext. Alexander wasn't interested in revenge. Revenge is a finite act. He was interested in the edge of the world. He wanted to stand where no man had stood, to see Oceanus, the great river that encircles the earth. We crossed the Hellespont in the spring of 334 BC. 160 triremes, the whole army, maybe 35,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry. Alexander stood at the prow of the flagship, in full armor, and threw his spear onto the Asian shore. A claim of ownership. The first man to set foot was him, splashing through the surf, claiming the continent by right of conquest before a single sword was drawn. We marched down the coast, past Troy, where he and Hephaestion laid wreaths on the tombs of Achilles and Patroclus. Some men called it romantic foolishness. We who knew him understood. He wasn't just visiting. He was reporting for duty, taking up a mantle he believed was his by blood, from his mother's side, from the lineage of Pyrrhus, son of Achilles. He was home. The Persian satraps, the governors of the western provinces, held a war council at Zelia. Memnon of Rhodes, a Greek mercenary general with more strategic sense than the entire Persian high command combined, told them a simple, brutal truth. Do not fight Alexander. He is not Philip. His infantry is invincible in a pitched battle. We must scorch the earth, burn the crops, poison the wells, retreat to the interior, and let his army starve while our fleet attacks Macedon itself. It was genius. It would have destroyed us. We had money for 30 days. If the land had been turned to ash, we would have crumbled before we even began. But the gods, the Persian gods of pride and folly, were with us. The satrap Arcides, a pompous fool with a silk robe and a beard drenched in perfume, stood up and declared, before all his peers, I will not allow a single house of my subjects to be burned. A noble sentiment, utterly idiotic. The other satraps, men like Spithridates and Mithridates, men who valued their personal honor and their dominion over the king of kings' strategy, agreed. They would make a stand. They would crush this Macedonian boy bandit on the banks of the river Granicus. We found them there, a glittering wall of Persian cavalry, maybe 20,000 horse, arrayed along the steep eastern bank. Their infantry, Greek mercenaries mostly, were held uselessly in the rear. A classic defensive position. A river, swollen with spring meltwater, cutting a deep channel. A high, muddy bank to scramble up. And at the top, the finest cavalry in the world, except for one. Alexander saw the trap, but he also saw the arrogance. They had placed their cavalry on the riverbank, where cavalry is static, defensive. They had given up their greatest weapon, the thunderous charge. They were waiting to be beaten. Parmenion, the old bull, Alexander's second in command, a veteran of Philip's endless wars, urged caution. It is late in the day, king. The river is treacherous. We should camp on our side, let them sweat through the night, and cross at dawn when their formation will be looser. It was sound advice. The kind of advice that keeps armies alive. Alexander looked at him with that fire in his mismatched eyes. One gray-blue like the sea, the other dark brown like the earth. He said, I would be ashamed, having crossed the Hellespont so easily, to be stopped by this little trickle of water. This would be an insult to the Macedonians' reputation and my own audacity. Let's attack. The word he used, tolma, audacity, it was the key to everything. He didn't command us to attack, he shamed us into wanting it. The battle line was drawn. The phalanx, the terrible, bristling heart of our army, formed the center, 6 regiments deep. The Sarissa, that 18-foot cornel would spear, was a forest of death. But at the Granicus, it was a secondary player. This was to be a cavalry battle, a knight's brawl on a riverbank. On the left wing, Parmenion commanded the Thessalian and allied Greek cavalry, solid, steady, the anvil. On the right, the Horn of Glory, Alexander took his place with the companions, 8 squadrons of the Macedonian nobility, the finest heavy cavalry the world has ever seen. They wore breastplates, Boeotian helmets, and carried the 9-foot Ziston lance. But their real weapon was the man at their head and the wedge formation he had perfected. At the very tip of the right wedge, in the squadron of the royal bodyguards, was Alexander. His armor was burnished silver, 2 white plumes streamed from his helmet, making him a visible god of war. The target? Yes. A symbol, a magnet for the courage of his men? Absolutely. For a long moment, there was a silence you could choke on. Just the rushing of the muddy water. The Persians sat on their high horses, armored in scales, their faces impassive. They recognized Alexander's armor. You could see the ripple of recognition, the pointing. The center of their line, directly across from him, thickened with elite commanders. Spithridates, Mithridates, Rosaces, the son-in-law of the great king, all jostling for a chance at the honor of killing the boy king. Alexander gave a signal. Not a horn, not a shout. Just a slight lift of his lance. Ptolemy, son of Lagus, one of his closest friends, was beside me. He swore later that, in that moment, Alexander's horse, Bucephalus, let out a scream, as if the beast itself was hungry for Persian blood. Then, the trumpet shattered the world. The companion cavalry plunged into the river. It wasn't a clean, parade ground advance. The current caught the horses. The riverbed was a slippery hell of round stones and sucking mud. Men were thrown, horses stumbled, lances dipped and splashed. But the momentum, the sheer, overwhelming momentum of 800 heavy horsemen in a wedge, pushed forward. Arrows and javelins from the Persian bank darkened the sun. They hammered into our shields, into horseflesh, into men. The screams started before we even reached the bank. A javelin took a man named Clitus next to me, straight through the throat. He was dead in the saddle, carried along by the press of bodies, his blood a hot spray on my face. And then we hit the bank. Digging our heels into our horses' flanks, clawing with their hooves at the crumbling earth and grass. The Persians fought down at us, a wall of spears and akinaki, those wicked curved Persian swords. They had the height, the weight of the downstroke. Our lances splintered against their armor. Men were dragged from their horses, pulled down into the mud, trampled into the riverbed. The water downstream ran pink, then a deep, choking red. It was a whirling chaos, a butcher's yard with no line, no order. And in the center of the maelstrom was Alexander. I saw him, his white plumes a beacon in the swirling dust and blood. He had fought his way up the bank, Bucephalus's massive hooves crushing a man's skull, his lance a blur. He killed Mithridates, Darius's son-in-law, with a single thrust through the face that burst out the back of his ornate helmet. The body hadn't even fallen when Rosaces was upon him. The Persian noble brought his battle axe down on Alexander's head with the force of a thunderbolt. Alexander's helmet, the beautiful iron helmet of Thebes, split. The double plumes were shorn clean off. I swear to Zeus, the whole battle seemed to hold its breath. Alexander reeled, his face a mask of blood. Rosaces raised his axe for the killing blow. Time slows in those moments. It becomes thick like honey. From Alexander's blind side, Spithridates charged, his scimitar raised, ready to decapitate our king. The axe was coming down from the front, the scimitar from the rear. He was dead. He was dead, and the war was over. And then a black blur. Clitus, son of Dropides. Clitus the Black, commander of the royal squadron. His hand was a shooting star. His curved coppice blade, heavy as a butcher's cleaver, swept through the air and caught Spithridates' arm at the shoulder. The arm, still clutching the scimitar, spun away in a geyser of crimson. Alexander, half-stunned, Bucephalus rearing, drove his shattered lance stump into Rosaces' face. The Persian fell back into the river. Clitus had killed the man who would kill a king. Alexander's life was saved. Clitus was a brother to him that day. And years later, In a drunken rage in a fort in Maracanda, Alexander would drive a sarissa through that same Clytus's heart. But that is a shadow for another fire. On that day, at the Granicus, there was only glory. The death of their leaders broke the Persian center. It was a thing you could feel, a spiritual collapse. The scale-armored cavalry, these proud lords, saw their champions butchered, saw the blood-mad boy king laughing through the red mask of his own blood, still killing, still advancing. They turned. The Persian cavalry on the wings, seeing the sacred center rupture, pulled back, then fled. The rout was not a chase, it was a dissolution. They scattered into the dust of the Phrygian plain. All that remained was the Persian infantry, the Greek mercenaries, stranded on a low hill behind the lines. 10,000 of them. They had played no part in the fight. Their commanders had been ignored. Now they stood in perfect, silent formation, a square of bronze and despair. They sent a herald, asking for quarter. Alexander, his judgment perhaps clouded by his wound and bloodlust, or perhaps making a cold political calculation, refused. He branded them traitors to the Hellenic cause and ordered the phalanx forward. It was not a battle. It was an execution. The sarissas, fixed in a bristling wall, pressed them from the front while the reformed cavalry charged their flanks and rear. We ground them into paste. Of the 10,000, 2,000 were captured, sent in chains to the mines of Macedon. The rest were food for the crows. Our dead, by comparison, were but a handful, mostly from the first brutal clash in the river. It was a message just like Thebes. If you are Greek and fight for Persia, do not expect mercy. This world is now Macedonian. The victory at the Granicus was total. It wasn't a strategic masterpiece, not like the great chess games to come. It was a razor-thin gamble, a personal duel multiplied by 10,000. But it opened Asia Minor like a treasure chest. Sardis, the fortress city, surrendered without a fight. Ephesus welcomed us as liberators. City after city threw open its gates. The legend of the invincible boy king, the new Achilles, spread before us faster than our scouts. Granicus was where that legend was forged, not in marble, but in blood and river mud. It was where the army, some of the older veterans who had doubted, finally fell in love with him. They had seen him fight a personal war, seen him almost die, seen him triumph. He was no longer just Philip's son. He was our Alexander. The storm had made landfall, and it would not stop for 11 years. The coast was ours, but the serpent's head was still attached. The Persian navy, manned by Phoenicians and Cypriots, dominated the sea. Memnon of Rhodes, who had escaped the slaughter at Granicus, was now leading a brilliant naval counterattack, threatening to cut our supply lines back to Greece. Alexander's strategy was a stroke of genius, so simple it was terrifying. He would not fight the Persian fleet at sea, where their skill was supreme. He would defeat it on land. He would march down the whole coast of the Mediterranean, taking every single port, every naval base, denying the Persian fleet a single beach where it could water, resupply, or find shelter. He would win a naval war by becoming a land force so irresistible that the sea itself became a desert for his enemies. This led us directly to Halicarnassus, a fortress city of immense power, commanded by Memnon himself. It was the first true siege of the campaign, and it was a horror. No open field of glory, no thundering cavalry charge. It was a grinding, month-long battle of wits and machines. We built siege towers taller than their walls, our engineers digging tunnels under their foundations. They would sally out at night, burning our towers, a swirling inferno in the dark, hand-to-hand combat with knives and torches. Memnon was a demon. He had catapults mounted on the walls that hurled stones the size of wine amphorae, crushing men into red paste. On one night attack, we breached a section of wall, and the city itself nearly fell, but Memnon rallied his veterans in the narrow streets with a desperate fury and pushed us back. The streets were choked with bodies, the cobbles so slick with blood that men slithered as they fought. We eventually took the city, but Memnon and a corps of his force escaped by sea to the citadel on an island, which held out for another year. Alexander simply detached a blockade force. He couldn't waste time. He had understood the concept of the center of gravity. The city was a shell, Memnon was the soul, and his soul had flown. The strategy was to keep moving, to apply unrelenting pressure. We left Halicarnassus a smoldering ruin, its harbor empty, another port denied to the enemy fleet. The campaign was now a rolling avalanche, moving east, then south, into the heart of winter and the rugged, hostile coast of Lycia and Pamphylia, where the sea itself was said to part for our king. A legend, nothing more, but it's true. We marched through a flooded coastal pass where the tide ebbed just enough for a man to wade through, and we all believed it was Poseidon bowing to the son of Zeus. That was the effect he had on us. We were no longer an army, we were a crusade. But the great king, Darius III Codominus, was no longer watching a distant border skirmish. He had executed the surviving fool from the Granicus war council. He had gathered his host. And he was coming for us. Issus. Issus. That is where boys become ghosts. We had been at Gordium for the winter, where Alexander cut the legendary knot, either by slicing it with his sword or by pulling out the pin, depending on who you believe. The point was the omen. Whosoever undid the knot would rule Asia. He claimed it. We marched through the Cilician gates, a narrow mountain pass so sheer the sky was a blue ribbon above us. Alexander, always first, scouted it with a handful of men. The Persian satrap who should have held it, a man who makes Arcides look like a genius, fled at the mere whisper of our approach. We poured into the rich plains of Cilicia. And then the news came. Darius. He was just over the mountains to our rear, in the Amic plain, with an army that defied counting. The camp gossips said 600,000. Even Parmenian's most sober estimate put it at over 100,000 fighting men. Alexander had made a rare misjudgment. Expecting Darius from the south, he was trapped, his army stretched thin along the coast. Darius, with his horde, had slipped around behind us, severing our line of retreat. We were cut off, our backs to the sea, a mountain range to one side, and the King of Kings' entire host on the other. In the staff meeting, the tent was a thick soup of fear. Veteran generals with faces of ash. Ptolemy was silent. Nearchus, the Cretan, was studying maps for an escape route that didn't exist. And Alexander was ecstatic. He gathered us, and his eyes had that divine fire. Men, he said, not generals, but men. The gods have delivered our enemy into our hands. Darius wants to fight us here, in a narrow coastal plain where his cavalry, his 10-to-1 advantage, will be useless. He will be a mob, confined by the sea, the mountains, and the river Panaris. He cannot flank us. His numbers mean nothing. He is making us a gift of the Persian Empire. Now let's go and take it. He didn't just dispel the fear. He transmuted it into a ferocious, almost frantic eagerness. We force-marched back north through the night, through the Syrian gates, a horrific nightmare march in pitch-black, pouring rain. Men fell down ravines. Torches hissed and died. We were a stumbling, cursing, terrified mob ourselves, emerging from the pass just before dawn. And as the sky turned the color of a faded bruise, we saw them. The plain of Issus, the sea on our left, the mountains on our right, and in between, a sight that stopped the heart. The entire plain was carpeted with men. A human ocean. The center was a wall of Greek mercenaries, Darius's true infantry, a solid, shining 20,000-man block of bronze and hate. On their flanks, tens of thousands of Persian infantry, Cardaques, armed in a strange mix of hoplite and Eastern style. And behind them, a sea of cavalry, rendered almost impotent by the terrain. In the absolute center, behind the Greek mercenaries, a glittering hillock, the great king's chariot, a golden jewel reflecting the first bloody rays of the sun. Darius himself, standing a head taller than his guards, a giant, beautiful man, his beard squared in ringlets, robed in purple and gold. He was a living god-king, and he was right there. But the ground was a gift. It was a classic pinning battle. Alexander deployed the phalanx in the center, the brigades of Caenus, Perdiccas, Meleager, Ptolemy, the household names of our army. He placed Parmenion on the left, by the sea, with a crucial, terrible task. Hold the flank against the mass of Persian cavalry that would inevitably try to roll us up. Just hold. Don't advance. Just die in place if you have to. And then, on the right wing, the mountainside, Alexander himself took the companion cavalry and the Hydaspes, the elite shield-bearers, the fastest and fiercest infantry in the world. His plan was so simple a child could see it, so audacious only a god could execute it. The left would anchor, the center would hold, and the right, a screaming wedge of force, would rip through the Persian left wing, pivot, and drive straight for Darius's golden chariot. Cut off the head. The body will die. The armies stood for hours, just staring. The distance closed. You could hear the hum of 100,000 prayers, the clash of bronze on bronze as men checked their armor straps one last time. The order came. A slow, step-by-step advance, the phalanx moving like a single, segmented beast. But the ground was uneven, cut by small streams. The phalanx's perfect line began to oscillate, to separate, tiny cracks appearing between the regiments. And then the Persian arrows came. Not in volleys, but in a continuous, horrible cloud, a storm that blackened the sky and turned day to twilight. Clattered off our helmets, thudded into shields, hissing into the sand. Men screamed. The gaps in the phalanx widened. The Greek mercenaries in Darius's center saw those gaps. With a cheer of hate for their fellow Greeks who had betrayed them at Granicus, they charged. 10,000 heavy infantry hitting our stretched, fragmented phalanx at full run. The collision was the sound of the world ending. Bronze on bronze, Sarissa against Dori, the grinding crash of shield bosses. The mercenaries, veterans all, punched into the fissures, their shorter spears stabbing up under the sarissas, gutting our front-rank men. The pesateroi, the foot companions, our unbeatable phalanx, began to buckle. They were being pushed back, their sarissas becoming a liability in the too-close press. For the first time in a generation, the Macedonian center was breaking. The sea of Persian cavalry on our left roared forward, crashing into Parmenions' outnumbered Thessalians. The world reduced to 1,000 personal struggles. The battle all along the line was hanging by a hair. And then from the right came the cry. Not a horn, not a trumpet. A raw, elemental scream. Alalalai. Alexander. He had seen the danger. He didn't wait. With his companion wedge and the Hydaspes racing on foot, he smashed into the Persian left wing. The Cardaques, lightly armed, were utterly unprepared for the sheer, bestial momentum of a charge led by the king himself. It was the Granicus on a grand scale. He didn't just hit them, he shattered them. A single blow, and the Persian left flank folded up like wet parchment. He didn't stop to loot, didn't stop to slaughter the routing men. He was a lance aimed at a single, glittering point. Darius watched. From his chariot, the King of Kings watched his left wing evaporate. He watched the white-plumed demon on the black horse, leaving a wake of corpses, turn towards him. Alexander had reined in his wedge, reformed it on the move, a cavalry maneuver that is almost impossible in the chaos of battle, and now, a single, solid fist of Macedonian nobility was charging directly at the great king's personal guard. Darius's nerve broke. The eyewitnesses, and there were many, say it was a moment of pure, existential terror. The king of the world, the lord of all peoples from the Aegean to India, the heir of Cyrus the Great, turned his golden chariot and fled. He didn't withdraw. He fled. He abandoned his army, his Greek mercenaries who were winning his battle for him, his elite kinsman cavalry, his mother, his wife, his children. The chariot bogged down in the bodies and the gore. Darius, in a final act of absolute panic, leaped from the chariot, mounted a horse, and fled into the mountains, casting off his purple royal mantle so he couldn't be identified. The rumor spread through the Persian host not as sound but as a sickness. The center, the hard-fighting Greek mercenaries who had been moments away from annihilating our phalanx, felt the spirit go out of their allies. They looked up from their slaughter and saw the great king's chariot empty. A groan of despair, a sound unlike anything I have ever heard, went up from 100,000 men. It was the sound of an empire collapsing. Their order disintegrated. They threw down their shields and ran, but there was nowhere to run. A narrow plain, choking with terrified men. Our phalanx, moments from defeat, surged forward with a roar of disbelief and savage joy. The Greek mercenaries, the only true soldiers on that field, died where they stood, in a defiant, bloody square, while their king fled like a whipped dog. The slaughter that followed was the stuff of nightmares. Persian cavalry, in their heavy-scale armor, tried to flee back through the narrow mountain passes, trampling their own infantry. The pass, known ever after as the Pillar of Jonah, became a dam of human flesh. We chased them for miles. The darkness saved more than our mercy. By nightfall, when we could barely lift our swords, the plain of Issus was a field of gold and silver and crimson. The treasures of the Persian high command, abandoned in the rout. We captured Darius's tent, his chariot, his bow, his shield. A thing of pure opulence. Alexander ordered a bath in Darius's golden tub, but found it full of blood and filth. He would not touch it. And then the women. The scream that cut through the camp when the queen mother, Sisygambes, mistook Hephaestion, who was taller and more handsome, for the king, and threw herself at his feet. Alexander's response was not anger, but a chillingly respectful tenderness. "You were not mistaken, mother," he said, lifting her up. "For this man too is Alexander." In that tent he secured more than a family of hostages. He began to capture the idea of legitimate Persian kingship. He treated Darius's family with a reverence that stunned us, and stunned the Persians even more. Issus was not just a victory. It was a coronation by the sword. Half the Persian Empire now lay open, undefended. The road to Egypt, to Babylon, to the heart of the world was paved with the dead from that narrow coastal plain. We were no longer rebels or invaders. We were the next dynasty. After Issus, the world held its breath. Darius fled east, beyond the Euphrates, to gather another, even more titanic host from the deepest parts of his empire. He sent a letter, offering half his empire, a royal marriage, and a mountain of gold for peace and the return of his family. Parmenion, ever the pragmatist, grumbled, "If I were Alexander, I would accept." Alexander's retort was sharp enough to cut stone. "So would I, if I were Parmenion." The reply to Darius was a proclamation, "The earth cannot bear two sons, nor Asia two kings. I am now the king of Asia. Come to me as your king, or come as an enemy, but come." But he didn't chase Darius immediately. The genius of his strategy continued. The Persian fleet was still a threat, and the Phoenician ports, especially Tyre, were its backbone. We turned south into the Levant. City after city surrendered. Sidon welcomed us. And then we came to Tyre, the island fortress, half a mile out to sea, its walls rising 150 feet straight out of the water. They sent envoys with a golden crown for Alexander, offering submission but refusing the one thing he demanded: entry. He wanted to sacrifice at the temple of Melkart, whom he identified with Heracles, his ancestor. The Tyrians, cunning and safe, said they would be neutral, friends to both. Their walls were invincible, their navy powerful. Alexander looked at that cold, smug island, and his face went. "You think you are safe because you are surrounded by water," he told them. "I will show you that you live on land. I will bring the land to you." The Siege of Tyre, January to July, 332 BC. It was not a battle. It was an act of human will so immense it becomes a myth just to speak it. We started to build a mole, a causeway from the mainland out to the island, 200 feet wide, using the stones and timber from the abandoned ruins of old Tyre on the coast. At first, it was almost a joke. We drove piles into the shallows, and the Tyrians on their walls laughed and shot arrows. But the mole crept forward, a slow, inexorable finger of doom. The Tyrians stopped laughing. They filled an old horse transport ship with pitch, bitumen, and sulfur, towed it to the end of the mole, set it ablaze, and rammed it into our siege towers. The fire was a living beast. It devoured the towers, the mantlets, the months of work, in a single apocalyptic afternoon. The wind whipped the flames, and we were driven back, deafened by the roar and the screaming of men burning alive. Alexander didn't blink. He ordered the mole widened. He ordered new towers, more of them. And then he did the thing the Tyrians never expected. He went to Sidon and Byblos and collected a fleet of over 200 ships. The Persian navies, seeing their cause lost after Issus, had mostly come over to the winning side. We returned to Tyre and found the Tyrian fleet cowering in their harbors. They had lost command of the sea in a single week. Now, Tyre was the one blockaded. The siege became a suffocation. For months, the Tyrians fought like demons. They set up massive mechanical winches on their walls, dropping boulders and iron weights on our ships. We invented a floating siege platform, lashing galleys together. They used divers with knives to cut our anchor cables. The Alexandrian solution was to use chains for anchors. They threw red-hot sand from the walls, a devilish weapon that got under armor and seared flesh to the bone, causing men to go mad with pain and leap into the sea. It was a daily hell of innovation and counter-innovation, a war of engineers where the penalty for failure was a horrific, screaming death by fire or drowning. The final breach came on the southern seawall. Alexander oversaw the construction of massive rams aboard his ships. 4 days, we pounded one section until it crumbled. A boarding bridge was lowered, a massive wooden thing covered in plates, and Alexander himself led the first wave of Hydaspes across it, a narrow gangplank into the jaws of hell. Admetus, the commander of the Hydaspes, was the first man on the wall, and was killed instantly by a Tyrian spear. Alexander was right behind him. He killed the spearman, and then it was a whirlwind of slaughter. The companions on the mole breached the other walls simultaneously. The city, after 7 months of terror and defiance, was finally open. What followed was a massacre that stains the memory. The Macedonians, enraged by the long siege, the burning of their comrades, the execution of prisoners on the walls, showed no mercy. The streets became rivers of blood. The temple of Melkart, which Alexander had used as a pretext for the whole war, became a charnel house. 6,000 Tyrian fighting men were slaughtered in the final assault. 2,000 others, young men in their prime, were crucified along the beach, their bodies a mile-long forest of agony for every passing ship to see. 30,000 women and children were sold into slavery. The city, the proud, ancient queen of the sea, was erased in a day. Only a handful escaped, hidden by the Sidonians who manned parts of our fleet, a silent act of mercy in a sea of cruelty. The message of Tyre was not just for Persia, it was for the whole world. Resistance does not end in defeat. It ends in annihilation. The path to Egypt was now a walk through a cowed and silent land. Gaza, a single fortress held by a eunuch named Battus, dared to resist. It took 2 months and another grim siege, where Alexander was wounded in the shoulder by a catapult bolt, a wound that drove a scream from him and nearly killed him. When Gaza fell, he famously dragged Battus's body, still living, behind his chariot around the walls, an act of chilling Homeric vengeance. He was Achilles, and no Patroclus was safe to be killed. Egypt, the land of the pharaohs, fell into our hands like a ripe date. They hated the Persians, their Zoroastrian masters who mocked their animal-headed gods. They saw Alexander as a liberator, a divine son of Ammon. He was crowned pharaoh at Memphis. And then, the most profound moment of his life, the trek into the Saharan wilderness to the oracle of Zeus Ammon at the Siwa oasis. He went with a handful of men. We lost the path, were saved by talking serpents sent by the god, or so the priest said. He went into the sanctum alone. We never knew what the oracle told him, but when he emerged, his face was a mask of serene, terrifying certainty. He began to call Zeus Ammon his true father, not Philip. The rumor became belief, and belief became reality. He was no longer just a king. He was a god, or at least the son of one. He founded Alexandria, the first and greatest of his 70 cities, a perfect grid at the mouth of the Nile, a future cosmopolis that he supposedly sketched out with barley meal because no chalk was available. It was here, under the endless Egyptian sky, that the idea of a universal empire, a brotherhood of mankind under his divine rule, first took root. But the world's true heart was not in Egypt. It was in Mesopotamia. Darius had sent another letter, offering a truly staggering bribe for peace, including all land west of the Euphrates. Alexander's reply was a model of autocratic logic. What you offer is already mine. I have come to Asia to take it, not to ask for it. I am the king of Asia. Do not write to me as an equal, but as your lord. Gaugamela, October 1st, 331 BC. The name itself sounds like thunder. This was the final act of the Greco-Persian Wars, the battle for the soul of an empire. We crossed the Euphrates and Tigris. Darius had chosen his ground, a featureless, flat plain near the village of Gaugamela, specifically prepared for his new weapons, scythed chariots and a squadron of 15 war elephants. He had scraped the empire clean of men. Bactrians, Sogdians, Scythians, Indians from the Indus, Medes, Babylonians, Armenians, the kinsman cavalry, the survivors of Issus. The lowest estimate was 200,000 men. Some say 1 million. I cannot count that high. I only know the plain was black. With them, a sea of humanity lit by countless campfires at night. We had 47,000 men. Parmenion, once again, the voice of a lifetime's experience, and other senior officers, a chorus of them, came to Alexander's tent the night before. They pleaded with him to attack at night. The Persians would be confused. It would negate their numbers. Alexander listened, his face smooth and calm, like a deep, still lake. He simply said, "I will not steal my victory." He knew the psychological impact of winning in broad daylight, in full view of the sun. A night attack would be dismissed as luck, a brawl. A daylight victory would be a divine judgment. He slept. Not a worried doze, but the sleep of a child. In the dead of night, Parmenion had to wake him for the final orders, and he found him so deeply asleep he was reluctant to rouse him. When asked how he could sleep with such a battle before him, Alexander said, "How could I not sleep? The battle is already won." Darius is finally offering battle on an open plain. He has gathered his entire host for me to break in a single day. But the dawn that came was a sight to terrify the dead. The Persian lines stretched so far beyond our flanks that we were a mere postage stamp of bronze in an ocean of colored cloth, scale armor, and glittering steel. The sound of their host was a constant, deep hum, pierced by the shriek of eastern horns. Alexander rode Bucephalus before our line, wearing a breastplate of double-layered linen and iron, a helmet of polished silver with a high crest, his sword a gift from the king of Sidium. He didn't give a long speech. He rode to the companion cavalry and just called out their names. A personal shout-out to each squadron commander, to the heroes he knew. He reminded us of our past victories, our invincible spirit. A roar went up, a single, defiant thunderclap that momentarily silenced the distant Persian hum. The plan was a masterpiece. He knew Darius expected a head-on phalanx attack, with the companions charging on the right. He knew the Persians would try to envelop our wings. So, Alexander invented a formation that had never been seen in battle. A hollow box on the move. The phalanx in the center, advancing en echelon, but on each wing he posted a second, rearward line of infantry, Thracian peltasts, Greek hoplite mercenaries, the ones who hadn't been at Granicus, Illyrian light troops. If the Persians tried to sweep around our flanks, they would hit this second line, forming a defensive angle, a reserve that could face any direction. Our camp, with the baggage and the royal women, was heavily fortified with Thracian infantry. He couldn't risk a repeat of the Issus panic. The battle began with the entire Persian line in motion. Darius, in his chariot at the center, was a magnificent, tragic figure. The Scythian and Bactrian cavalry on the Persian left, wild horsemen in fur caps, launched a massive flanking movement. Our right-wing cavalry, under Menidas, was ordered to intercept them, not to win, but to draw them away. A swirling, desperate cavalry battle opened up far on the dusty edge of the plain, men slashing and dying in a separate world. Darius, seeing his left engaged, gave the signal. The ground in front of our right center heaved. 15 scythe chariots, their axles studded with yard-long, razor-sharp blades, their horses armored, charged directly at the companion wedge. The hope was to shred our formation, to dismember us in a spray of limbs. We had trained for this. The foot archers and Agrianian javeliners, the fastest skirmishers in the world, ran out. A hail of projectiles struck the drivers and horses. They fell tangled crushed. The chariots that got through found the phalanx had opened corridors. The Sarissa ranks simply split, creating lanes. The horses, not being suicidal, ran into the empty spaces, and as they passed through, the rear-rank men stabbed the drivers and hamstrung the horses. It was a perfect, disciplined assassination. The chariots, which had been the Persians' great hope, achieved nothing but a pile of screaming horseflesh. Now, the main Persian left center, the Bactrians and the kinsman cavalry, seeing the chariot failure, surged forward. A gap opened. A massive, yawning gap in the Persian line, to the left of Darius's central position. It was the moment Alexander had lived for. He raised his sword. The trumpet signal was a single, prolonged scream. The companion wedge, with Alexander at the tip, and the 4 brigades of the right-wing phalanx, turned. They didn't charge forward. They charged diagonally, at an angle, straight into the gap. We were a battering ram aimed directly at Darius's heart. The momentum was a physical force, a wave. The wedge punched through the Persian screen, drove deep into the inner body of the army. The dust was a choking, blinding cloud. We could see nothing, only the man next to us, only the white plume ahead. We were fighting blind, killing blind. But the price of that perfect charge was paid on our left. The massive Persian right wing, under Mazias, a brilliant Persian general, had swarmed around Parmenian's position. The Thessalian cavalry, outnumbered 5-1, was fighting a desperate, dying retreat. The Persian cavalry, some units of Indian and Persian horse, bypassed the entire battle and rode directly for our camp. They began to massacre the baggage guards to free the Persian royal women. Sysigambes, Darius's mother, refused to flee. A rider was sent, desperately, to Alexander, pleading for help. The famous message, "The king is lost. The camp is overrun." The rider found Alexander deep inside the Persian host, his sarissa broken, his sword dripping, driving ever onward towards the fleeing form of Darius. His answer to the desperate plea was a legend. "Tell Parmenion to fight his own battle. If we win on this wing, we have won the war." And it was true. Darius, seeing the wedge coming, seeing the dust, hearing the roar of Macedonian voices getting closer and closer, felt the same soul sickness he had felt at Issus. His charioteer was killed by a javelin. The great king, for the second time, turned and fled. The panic was instantaneous. The kinsman cavalry, the immortals, the Bactrians, all who saw their king flee, broke. The entire center and left of the Persian army dissolved into a terrified mob. But Alexander could not chase. The message from Parmenion was impossible to ignore. The Thessalians were being slaughtered. With a roar of frustration, Alexander reined in his companions, turned them around, and charged back through the heart of the battlefield. He smashed straight into the rear of the Persian right wing, the very cavalry that was overwhelming Parmenion. The clash was titanic. It was the hardest cavalry fight of the entire war, a swirling melee of companions in their silver armor against the cream of the Persian nobility, who knew they were already dead but fought with the fury of trapped wolves. 60 companions died in that single, forgotten action. Hephaestion was wounded by a spear thrust. It was a bloody, grinding, personal war, fought in a cloud of dust so thick you couldn't tell friend from foe. But Alexander's impact turned the tide. Mazias, seeing the King of Kings was fled and his own rear under attack, disengaged. The entire Persian host was now in flight. The chase that night was a horror movie. Alexander drove us across the Lycus River, a pursuit in the pitch black, lit only by the torches of fleeing Persians and the screaming of the wounded. Horses died of exhaustion. Men drank water from pools choked with corpses. We captured Darius's chariot, his bow, his money, everything but the man himself. He fled into the mountains of Media, his empire gone, his army evaporated. Gaugamela was the death of the Achaemenid Empire. We marched into Babylon, and the city opened its gates with flowers and incense. The great temple of Esagila welcomed him. He sacrificed to Marduk, something the Persians had refused to do. Susa surrendered, yielding a treasure of 50,000 talents of silver, more money than the Greek world had seen in all its history. The palace of Persepolis, the heart of Persian identity, the mystical seat of Ahura-Mazda on earth, fell. What followed was the burning of that magnificent palace. Some said it was an act of policy, the final symbolic end of Persian rule. Some said it was a drunken, offhand remark by the Athenian courtesan Thais, who handed Alexander a torch, demanding revenge for the burning of the Acropolis 150 years earlier. I was there. It was both. We were all drunk on wine and victory. The king threw the first torch, and we, his captains, followed. The cedar beams, the silk curtains, the ancient tapestries of the King of Kings, a pillar of fire that lit the plain for 50 miles, a pyre for an empire. The next morning, sober, some felt regret. Alexander, I think, never did. He had burned the past. The future was his alone. But Darius was still alive. The chase was a mad, brutal dash through the Caspian gates. Men and horses collapsed and were left. We pushed for days without sleep, covering 400 miles in 11 days. When we finally caught up to the Persian baggage train near Hecatompylos, we found Darius not alive, but murdered. Stabbed by his own satraps, Bessus and Nabarzans, left in a cart, pierced with 100 wounds, his body broken. Alexander arrived just in time to see him die. I saw the king dismount, take his own purple cloak, and drape it over the body of his enemy. It was a gesture of pure, theatrical genius. He wasn't a conqueror anymore. He was the avenger. He was the rightful heir. He would hunt down the regicide Bessus across the roof of the world, into Bactria and Sogdia, and bring him to a Persian-style execution, his nose and ears cut off, then crucified. The world turned a page. The crusade was over. The war of conquest was over. Now it was an internal, personal, imperial war. The years that followed in the east, Bactria and Sogdia, were not battles but a grinding, brutal counterinsurgency. A constant, bloody siege of mountain fortresses, the Sogdian Rock, the Rock of Koreans, where men froze to death at night and were picked off by guerrilla arrows during the day. It was there that Alexander fought his most personal duel, at Syropolis, where he was struck in the head with a stone, temporarily blinded, a flash of white pain that left him raging and terrified. It was there he married the Bactrian princess Roxanne, a girl of breathtaking beauty, a political act to soothe the conquered, but also, I believe, a moment of genuine passion. It was there, in a drunken stupor, that he killed Clitus, the man who saved his life at the Granicus, during a bitter, escalating argument about Persian customs and Macedonian pride. The horror of that act broke him. He locked himself in his tent for 3 days, refusing food and water, calling himself a murderer. The army had to pass a formal decree declaring Clitus a traitor, posthumously, to absolve him. But the stain never left his soul. The conqueror of the world was also its prisoner, trapped by his own terrifying, boundless ambition. This is the natural flow. The story continues from the death of Clitus, through the Proskynesis controversy, the Pages conspiracy, the invasion of India. The Battle of the Hydaspes against King Porus, a masterpiece of deception in crossing a river under monsoon skies, fighting a corps of elephants in the mud, where Alexander's horse Bucephalus, old and faithful, finally died from wounds and exhaustion. It was the hardest, bloodiest infantry fight of his career against the 7-foot-tall Indian king. And then, the halt at the Hyphasis River, the only battle Alexander ever lost, not to an enemy, but to his own men, who simply refused to march further east into the unknown Ganges plain. His tantrum, his 3 days of sullen silence, and the building of 12 towering altars to the gods to mark the end of the world. The terrible march back through the Gedrosian desert, a disaster of thirst and heat where 60,000 camp followers, women, children, merchants, all perished in the sand, a silent, screaming holocaust. The return to Babylon, the death of Hephaestion, Alexander's beloved, a loss that shattered his mind and spirit, leading to a rampage of grief, ordering the false lighthouses of Ecbatana. And then, the final fever, the slow, creeping sickness, the whispered words to his generals, the bequeathal of his empire to the strongest. The room of weeping companions, the silent city, the world holding its breath as a storm of 13 years finally, unbelievably, went still on the 11th of June, 323 BC. The storyteller pauses. The fire has burned down to embers. The only sound is the crackle of the dying wood and the distant wind. "I told you," he says, pouring himself a cup of unmixed wine. He wasn't a man. He was a storm. And when the storm passed, the world was a different shape. It was flattened. It was connected. 100 cities bearing his name, a common language stretching from the pillars of Heracles to the industry Greeks meditating in India, Buddhists in Alexandria. He didn't just conquer the world. He broke the wall between East and West. And we, the men who followed him, we were the lightning. So now you know. Now you know the truth of it. Drink your wine. The night is cold, and the dead are listeningus.